It was supposed to be just another routine mission. Jack had been assigned to a remote part of the planet. Nothing too dangerous, just a diplomatic visit to negotiate trade routes with an alien species. The planet, Zenthora, was lush and beautiful, filled with towering trees and sprawling fields. The air was thick with the scent of unknown flowers, and Jack couldn't help but admire the strange, peaceful beauty of it all. But things didn't go according to plan. As Jack made his way through the dense forest, he heard the unmistakable sound of rustling nearby. At first, he thought it was just an animal, maybe a large creature moving through the underbrush. But then he heard it again, a scream. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, sharp and full of pain. His heart raced as he darted toward the sound. There, in a clearing, he saw her. A woman. No, not just any woman. She was an alien, her skin shimmering in the dappled sunlight, her eyes wide and full of fear. She wore elaborate robes, unlike anything Jack had ever seen, and her hair was like silver threads that caught the light in a way that made her seem almost ethereal. She was surrounded by huge, terrifying creatures, monstrous beasts with claws as sharp as knives and eyes glowing with hunger. The creatures were closing in on her, and she was struggling to move, trapped and helpless. Without thinking, Jack rushed forward. He had no plan, no time to strategize. His instincts kicked in. He grabbed a long branch from the ground and swung it at the nearest beast, knocking it back. The other creatures snarled and lunged at him, but Jack wasn't going to let them take her. He fought them off, using everything he had, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled to protect her. The battle was quick but brutal. Jack's clothes were torn, and he was covered in scratches, but he managed to scare the creatures off. They retreated into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Jack stood there, breathing heavily, his body aching from the fight. But his eyes never left the alien woman. She was still on the ground, breathing heavily, clearly shaken by the attack. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment there was silence. Jack didn't know what to say, but he extended his hand to help her up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough from the adrenaline. She nodded, though she still seemed a little unsteady. "I am. Fine. But you saved me." Jack smiled, though he was still trying to catch his breath. "It's nothing. I couldn't just let those things get you." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand something. She seemed to be considering her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You do not understand. By saving me, you have bound yourself to me." Jack frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Bound? What do you mean?" Before she could answer, there was a sudden sound of movement in the trees. More Vaxians, her people, emerged from the forest, surrounding them. Jack tensed, unsure whether this was good or bad. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper as she turned to face him. "You are not just a hero, human. You are now my future." Jack spent the next few hours pacing through the unfamiliar corridors of Zira's royal ship. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in some sort of twisted dream. There was no way this was real. He had come here as part of a peaceful mission, and now, thanks to a simple act of bravery, he was expected to marry an alien princess. He still couldn't believe it. He walked into a small room where a few of Zira's closest advisors were waiting. Zira herself wasn't there yet, but her presence lingered, filling the air with tension. Jack needed answers, and he needed them fast. One of the advisors, a tall, armored figure with green skin and sharp features, looked at Jack with a cold stare. "You must accept the law, human. The princess is already in danger from the political factions here. If you refuse, the consequences will be grave, for both of you." Jack tried to keep his voice steady, though frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "I don't care about the consequences. I didn't save her to get married. I did what anyone would have done." The advisor's gaze hardened. "It's not about what you want, human. It is the law of our people. You will marry her, or we will be forced to make you." Jack clenched his fists, feeling a spark of defiance. He wasn't just going to give in to some random alien law. He had his own life, his own choices. He wasn't about to be forced into a marriage with someone he barely knew. "I don't care about your customs," Jack said firmly. "Back on Earth, we don't have laws like this. We don't marry people just because we help them. You can't just tell me what to do." The advisor sneered. "You are not on Earth now. You are on Xanthora, and here, our customs are sacred." Jack's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this. He couldn't stay here, not like this. He wasn't going to let his life be decided by some bizarre tradition. He needed to talk to Zira directly, figure out if there was any way to get through this mess. As if on cue, Zira walked in. She wore a regal outfit, the kind only royalty would wear, her posture straight, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly, her voice full of empathy. "You don't want this. I understand. But you must know, refusing is not an option. Our laws are absolute." Jack turned toward her, trying to hide his frustration. "Zira, I didn't save you because I expected anything. I don't want to get involved in your political games. I came here to help, not to get trapped in your world." Zira sighed, her expression conflicted. "I never wanted this either, but you saved my life. And now, the Council and my people are demanding it. There is no escape for either of us. But please, understand, this isn't just about politics. It's about unity, about creating peace between our people." Jack paused. The sincerity in her voice made him hesitate. "I'm not some pawn in your game, Zira. I'm a person. I came here to help, not to be forced into a marriage." She looked at him, her face full of sorrow. "I know, but sometimes duty calls for sacrifices. I am the one who must bear the weight of our traditions." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't how I wanted to help. I'm just trying to figure out what to do." Zira stepped closer, her voice soft. "If you don't marry me, you'll be considered an enemy of my people. But if you do, we can find a way to make it work, not just for us, but for our future." Jack was silent, his mind spinning with all the possibilities. He didn't know what to do, but he couldn't walk away from this now. There was something about Zira, something more than just a princess caught in her customs. But the choice was still his, wasn't it? The day of the wedding was approaching fast, and with it, the weight of all the expectations. Jack had spent the last few days trying to mentally prepare himself for what lay ahead, but the reality was more overwhelming than he had ever imagined. Every step he took in the palace seemed to be watched by countless eyes. Every word he spoke was analyzed and dissected by the people of Xanthora. Despite all the political pressure, despite the looming doubts in his mind, there was one thing Jack was sure of. He wanted to be with Zira. The bond between them had grown from a forced obligation to something much deeper. He had come to care for her, not just as a princess, but as a person, someone who understood him, someone who, like him, was trapped by the weight of duty. Zira, too, had felt the shift in their relationship. What had begun as a marriage of necessity had slowly transformed into something that felt real and genuine. She wasn't just marrying Jack to fulfill a law or tradition. She was marrying him because, in her heart, she knew he was the one she wanted to be with. But the pressure from her people was relentless. The council and the nobles would not let her forget the role she had to play, no matter how personal her feelings had become. On the day before the wedding, Jack and Zira met in the royal gardens once again, the place where they had first opened up to each other. It felt fitting that they would have one final moment of peace before everything changed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden, and the air was warm, almost as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Zira stood by the fountain, her back to Jack. She seemed lost in thought, her face calm but her eyes distant. Jack approached her quietly, not wanting to disturb her. "Zira," he said softly, breaking the silence. She turned to face him, offering him a small but sincere smile. "Jack, Tomorrow is the day, isn't it? He nodded, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of the future. Yeah, it's hard to believe that all of this is happening. I never thought I'd be standing here, on the eve of a wedding that feels like it's not even real. Zira's expression softened, and she stepped closer to him. I know it feels strange, but we've come this far. Tomorrow, it's not just about duty anymore. It's about us. Jack's chest tightened. You know, Zira, I still don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll be accepted here, if your people will ever see me as more than just an outsider. But I do know that I want to be with you. Zira reached out, taking his hand in hers. I want that too, Jack. No matter what happens, I choose you. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision heavy but comforting at the same time. Jack squeezed her hand, reassuring both of them that they had made the right choice. Tomorrow, Jack said, his voice steady, we'll face everything together. I won't let you face this alone. Zira nodded, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye, though she quickly wiped it away. Together, she whispered. As they stood there, the weight of their decision settled around them like a cloak, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. They had made their choice, and no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but Jack and Zira were ready. Tomorrow, they would make their vows, not just because they were forced to, but because they truly wanted to. Together, they could change the future, one step at a time. Over the next few days, Jack and Zira spent more time together, trying to navigate the difficult situation they found themselves in. Every conversation, every glance between them seemed to carry more weight than the last, and Jack couldn't help but feel drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a princess, a figure of royal duty and tradition. She was real, human in her emotions, just like him. It was strange how quickly things had changed. At first, he had only seen Zira as someone trapped by her royal duties, someone who was bound by tradition and law. But now, as they spent time together, Jack saw the cracks in the facade. Zira wasn't just a princess. She was a person with hopes, fears, and desires of her own. She had been thrust into this marriage by custom, yet she had never really had a choice in the matter. One afternoon, Zira invited Jack to join her for a walk in the royal gardens, a place she often came to when she needed to think. The air was warm, the smell of blooming flowers filling the air, and the sound of distant birdsong was a peaceful background to their quiet stroll. For once, they weren't surrounded by the pressure of politics or royal advisors. It was just the two of them. I used to come here as a child, Zira said, her voice soft as she walked beside him. Before all the royal duties, before the constant pressure, this place was my escape. Jack looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. He had never seen her like this, away from the weight of her crown, just a person enjoying the simple things in life. It made him want to protect her, even more than before. This is a beautiful place, he said, his voice warm. I can see why you love it here. Zira smiled, her eyes softening. It's one of the few places where I feel like I can breathe. Sometimes, I wish I could just leave all of this behind, you know. Jack nodded, understanding more than he could express. I can't even imagine what it must be like for you, always having to live up to everyone's expectations. Zira stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes were filled with sincerity. I never asked for this life, Jack. I never asked to be a symbol of my people's traditions. All I've ever wanted is to live freely, to make my own choices. But that's not possible when you're a princess. Jack could see the pain in her eyes, and it made his heart ache. She wasn't just a royal figure. She was a woman trapped in a role she never wanted. It was hard to imagine the pressure she had been under her whole life, the weight of a crown she had never chosen. I can't imagine what it's like to be in your shoes, Jack said quietly. But I do know one thing. You're not alone in this. I may not be able to understand everything about your world, but I'm here for you, and I'll help you through this. Zira looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Jack. That means more to me than you know." For the first time, Jack felt a real sense of connection with Zira. She wasn't just a princess he had been forced to help. She was someone he could care for, someone who had her own struggles and dreams. The idea of marrying her, once something he had dreaded, didn't seem so impossible anymore. Maybe there was a chance for them. After all, a chance to build something real, beyond the confines of tradition and duty. But deep down, Jack knew there were still challenges ahead. They would have to fight not only for their marriage, but for the future they both wanted. The day after the wedding, Jack and Zira stood together on the balcony of the royal palace, watching as the sun rose over the vast landscape of Xanthora. The air was cool, carrying the scent of distant forests and fresh rain. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start after all the tension and struggles that had led them to this point. The wedding had gone off without a hitch, but it wasn't the ceremony that had mattered most. It was the moment they had shared afterward, alone in the quiet of their chambers. For the first time, they were truly free to be themselves, without the weight of tradition and expectation hanging over them. In that moment, Jack realized how much they had already overcome together, and how much more they would face in the future. Zira stood beside him, her hand resting gently on the railing. Her eyes were soft as she looked out at the horizon, her thoughts seemingly far away. Jack glanced at her, seeing the peaceful expression on her face. Despite all the challenges they had faced, despite the resistance they had encountered from her people, Zira was finally able to breathe. "It's hard to believe it's over," Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but filled with awe at the journey they had just begun. "I never imagined a day like this would come." Zira smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Neither did I. But here we are." Jack leaned against the railing, his eyes never leaving her. "I didn't just marry you because of duty. I married you because I wanted to be with you. I want this, Zira. I want us to build something together." Zira turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a deep understanding. "I feel the same way. When this all started, I thought it was just a way to fulfill a duty. But now, I see it differently. I see us, and I want to build something with you too. Something real." They stood there for a few moments, the sounds of the palace bustling below them, but the world around them felt still and quiet. There was no immediate threat, no political pressure looming over them. They were just two people, looking toward the future, ready to face it together. The people of Xanthora would need time to accept the marriage, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. Jack knew that. But in this moment, standing beside Zira, he felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. They had made it through the hardest part, the decision to stand by each other despite all the odds. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Jack asked quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. He was still aware of the political factions that had opposed the marriage, the nobles who had questioned his worth. But Zira's calm presence next to him gave him the strength he needed. Zira looked up at the sky, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we will prove ourselves. We'll show them that we're strong together. And maybe, in time, they'll see it too." Jack smiled, the uncertainty fading from his heart. Together. Zira's smile mirrored his. Together. They stood in silence for a while longer, just enjoying the peaceful moment. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibilities. Whatever challenges came their way, Jack and Zira would face them together, as partners, as equals. They had chosen each other, and that choice would guide them forward. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the land, signaling the start of a new day. And for Jack and Zira, it was the start of a new life, one they would build, side by side. The decision had been made. Jack and Zira would marry, not just because of the law, but because they had both chosen to give this union a chance. But as the days passed, it became clear that the real challenges were only just beginning. The palace was buzzing with activity. The wedding preparations were underway, but not everyone was pleased. Whispers filled the halls, and Jack could feel the eyes of the royal court on him everywhere he went. Some were curious, others judgmental, but many of the Vaxian nobles were still fiercely opposed to the marriage. "Your Highness, we cannot allow this," one of Zira's advisors, a tall, stern man named Drakkar, said one evening. He stood in the royal meeting room, his hands clasped behind his back as he addressed Zira. "A human on the throne. It will undermine everything our people stand for." Zira stood her ground, her expression calm but firm. "Drakkar, we've been over this. The marriage is not just a political matter anymore. It's a personal choice, mine and Jack's." Drakkar's face flushed with anger. "Personal choice. You have a duty to your people. Your marriage is not just about you. It's about the future of the Vaxian kingdom. A human cannot lead our people." Zira's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I am the princess. It is my decision to make. We cannot live in the past forever. If this union helps bring about peace, then it is worth it." Jack stood quietly in the corner of the room, his arms crossed. He had been silent throughout most of the conversation, but the words stung. He wasn't just a man caught in a marriage for the sake of peace. He was a stranger in a foreign land, trying to navigate a world that seemed so different from his own. It wasn't easy. He had known that going into this, but hearing the nobles speak like that, questioning his worth, made the weight of the situation feel even heavier. "Jack," Zira said, turning to him with a reassuring smile, "don't listen to them. This is our choice." Jack gave her a tight smile, though he felt anything but reassured. He knew Zira was doing everything she could to defend their marriage. But the truth was, there were a lot of people in the palace who would never accept him as a worthy partner for their princess, and the thought of what might happen if the marriage failed, or if the political factions turned against them, weighed heavily on his mind. Later that evening, Jack and Zira walked through the royal gardens again. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the quiet sound of water trickling from the fountains the only noise between them. "Do you ever feel like you're fighting a losing battle?" Jack asked, his voice low. "I mean, no matter what we do, it feels like there are always people ready to tear us apart." Zira stopped walking and looked up at him, her eyes softening with understanding. "I know it feels that way. It's hard to change centuries of tradition, but we're not doing this just for us. We're doing it for our people, for a better future." Jack nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. "I want to believe that, but it's going to be a long road, isn't it?" Zira smiled slightly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "It's never going to be easy, Jack, but nothing worth having ever is." Jack looked down at her hand on his arm and felt a surge of warmth. Despite all the challenges ahead, despite the political struggles and the people who would never accept him, there was one thing he knew for sure. He didn't want to face it without Zira by his side. "I'm with you, Zira. Whatever happens, I'm with you." She smiled, a true smile, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lessen. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult, that their marriage would be met with resistance, but they also knew they had each other. And that was a start. The tensions in the palace were rising, but Jack and Zira had made a decision. They would face whatever came next together. Jack stood there, still processing what had just happened. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but his mind was racing. He'd just saved an alien princess from a deadly attack, something he never imagined would happen on a diplomatic mission. But now she was telling him something that didn't make sense. "By saving me, you have bound yourself to me," she said again, her voice soft but serious. Jack blinked in confusion. "Bound? What are you talking about?" The alien woman, who had introduced herself as Princess Zira, seemed to hesitate for a moment. The other Vaxians who had appeared from the trees were silent, watching the exchange between Jack and their princess with keen interest. They all looked like they were waiting for something, some sort of confirmation. Zira took a deep breath and then explained, "It is a custom of my people. When an outsider saves a royal member of our family, the one who saves us is obligated to marry the royal. It is our law." Jack stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief and shock. "What? Are you serious? I'm just a human from Earth. I didn't save you because I wanted something from you. I was just trying to help." Zira nodded slowly, her eyes sincere. "I understand that, but the law is clear. You saved me. Now you are bound by our custom. There is no escaping it." Jack looked around at the Vaxians who were still standing by, their faces unreadable. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to accept their princess's words. He was starting to realize that this wasn't just some simple misunderstanding. This was a matter of their culture, and it was serious. He took a step back, trying to process everything. "Wait, so you're saying that I have to marry you now?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Zira's face softened. "Yes, that is what the law demands. You do not have a choice." Jack rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the situation. He had just arrived on this planet for a peaceful mission, and now he was being told that he had no choice but to marry an alien princess. It was absurd. "I'm not even from your world," Jack said, trying to reason with her. "I don't know your customs, your people, or anything about this place. How could I possibly?" Zira interrupted him gently. "I do not expect you to understand, human, but the law is the law. There are no exceptions." She paused, her expression becoming more thoughtful. "Perhaps we can find a way to make this easier for you. I know this is unexpected, but in time, you may come to understand why it is important." Jack sighed, frustration building inside him. This wasn't how he'd imagined his day would go. His mission was already off track, and now he was stuck in the middle of some strange cultural ritual he didn't even agree with. The other Vaxians were still watching him, some whispering quietly amongst themselves. Jack felt like he was under a microscope. "I need some time to think about this," he said, trying to gather his thoughts. "This is a lot to take in." Zira nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Of course, you have time. But know this, there is no escaping what has happened. We will discuss the details of the union when you are ready." Jack nodded slowly, still in a daze. As he walked away to give himself some space, he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. How would he navigate this strange new world? And most importantly, could he really follow through with this marriage? Zira sat on the edge of her royal bedchamber, her hands clasped tightly together. The golden light from the setting sun streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, she could hear the soft hum of the palace as the Vaxian servants went about their duties. But all of that felt distant now, like a world far removed from the heavy weight she was carrying. She had never wanted this. Marriage was a duty, a responsibility she had been prepared for her entire life. But it had always been a choice of her people, never hers. Now her life had been turned upside down by a human, a man she barely knew, someone who had only saved her because he thought it was the right thing to do. The law was clear. There was no escaping it. But as Zira thought about Jack, the human who had rescued her, who had risked his life without a second thought, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't part of her world, but there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if their lives could be different, if she could have something different. The idea of marrying Jack wasn't something Zira had planned, not in the least. Her heart was heavy with the responsibility of being a princess, a leader, someone whose every decision impacted the future of her people. Yet, her emotions were pulling her in another direction, one that felt both terrifying and exciting. Zira looked down at her hands, where the delicate gold bracelet her mother had given her lay. It was a symbol of her royal bloodline, a reminder of the legacy she was expected to uphold. But what if she could be more than just the princess, more than the pawn in political games? What if, just for once, she could make a choice for herself? She stood and walked to the large mirror hanging on the wall, studying her reflection. She looked every bit the princess her people expected her to be. Elegant, composed, strong. But beneath that facade, Zira was scared. Scared of the marriage that was now expected of her. Scared of being trapped in a life of tradition. Scared of losing herself to the weight of her crown. But then, Jack's face appeared in her mind. His determination, his willingness to help, his sincerity. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't here for power or gain. He was here because he cared. That thought made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She had to admit, she hadn't expected to feel this way. She hadn't expected to like Jack, let alone trust him. But she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, something deeper than duty, something more than just an obligation. Zira's heart told her that there was more to this marriage than what the customs had planned for her. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Jack entering the room. His expression was serious, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. Zira took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Jack," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I know this isn't what you expected. You didn't sign up for this. But there's something you should know about me." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Zira took a step closer to him, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want this either. But I can't ignore what's happening between us. Maybe this marriage can be more than just a political union. Maybe it can be something real." Jack looked at her, his eyes softening. "You're saying there's a chance we can make this work?" Zira nodded. "I think so. But it will be difficult. Our people will not accept anything less than full commitment. We will have to navigate this together." Jack was silent for a moment, considering her words. He could feel the sincerity in her voice, the weight of her decision. "I'm willing to try if you are," Jack said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll figure this out." Zira smiled, a small relieved smile that tugged at her heart. It wasn't going to be easy. But with Jack by her side, maybe they could find a way to make it work. Days passed, and the pressure on both Jack and Zira only grew. The palace was filled with whispers, and the council members who had initially been calm were now pushing harder for the marriage to take place. The idea of uniting with a human was still met with resistance from many of Zira's people, but the law was clear, and the royal council was determined to see it through. Jack couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. He had tried to maintain his composure, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. He had never expected his life to take such a turn, but now he was being forced into a situation where there was no way out. Zira, too, felt the weight of her people's expectations. She had always known her life would be filled with duty, but the reality of her situation was beginning to feel suffocating. The pressure to marry Jack was unrelenting, and yet she found herself more conflicted than ever. She didn't want a marriage born of obligation, but she also didn't want to disappoint her people, especially when the future of her kingdom rested on her shoulders. One afternoon, Zira invited Jack to meet her in the royal gardens once again. It had become their place of quiet refuge, where they could speak freely without the eyes of the royal court on them. As Jack walked into the garden, he saw her standing by the fountain, her back turned to him as she stared into the flowing water. She looked lost in thought, her shoulders tense, as if carrying the weight of an entire world on her back. "Zira?" Jack's voice was soft, but it reached her. She turned to face him, her expression serious, yet there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. "Jack," she said, her voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Jack stepped closer, sensing the change in her tone. "And?" Zira took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I know that you didn't ask for this. I know you didn't come here to marry me. And I understand why you're upset. But I can't ignore the fact that we're in this together now. We have no choice but to move forward." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Zira, you don't have to do this for me. I didn't save you to get married. I wanted to help. That's it." Zira shook her head, a small smile appearing on her lips. "I know. But the truth is, Jack, I'm starting to see things differently. I can't deny what's happening between us. We've been forced into this situation, yes, but there's something real here. Something I never expected." Jack blinked, unsure of where this was heading. "What do you mean?" Zira took another step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected of me. I've never been able to choose my own path. But with you, Jack, for the first time, I feel like I might have the chance to make my own choice. And maybe, just maybe, we can make this work, not just as a political marriage, but as something more, something real." Jack stood there, stunned by her words. He hadn't expected this. Zira wasn't just offering him a marriage out of duty. She was offering him a chance at something deeper, something that could go beyond the traditions of her people. "I'm not saying it will be easy," Zira continued, her voice steady now. "But if you're willing to give this a chance, to make it real, then I am too. I don't want to just go through the motions. I want something more than that. I want to build something with you." For the first time in days, Jack felt a sense of clarity. He had been resisting this union, fighting against something he thought was impossible. But now, standing before Zira, he realized that there was a possibility for something real. It wouldn't be perfect, but maybe it could be enough. Jack nodded slowly, his heart racing. "Okay, I'll try. If you're willing to take that chance, then so am I." Zira smiled, her eyes lighting up with a mix of relief and hope. "Thank you, Jack." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision settling between them. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be full of challenges, both personal and political. But for the first time, Jack felt like he wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. He was making his own choice. And maybe, just maybe, they could make it work together. The wedding day arrived, and the entire palace seemed to buzz with activity. Servants rushed through the halls, preparing everything for the ceremony, while the air itself felt thick with anticipation. For Jack, every step felt surreal. He had been through many difficult situations in his life, but nothing compared to the weight of what was happening now. He was standing on the brink of something that would change his life forever. Zira had kept a calm exterior all day, but Jack could see the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the delicate fabric of her wedding gown. She was dressed in the traditional Vaxian attire, her long hair intricately braided, and her face was painted with the royal markings that symbolize her status. Despite her composed appearance, he could see the anxiety behind her eyes. She, too, was nervous about what the future would hold, about the acceptance of her people, and most of all, about their marriage. Jack stood at the entrance of the grand hall, his hands tightly gripping the fabric of his suit. He had been trying to prepare himself for this moment all week, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was about to happen. He wasn't just marrying Zira, he was becoming part of an entirely different world, a world filled with traditions and expectations that were far beyond anything he had ever known. He caught sight of Zira standing at the far end of the hall, waiting for him. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them. Despite all the pressure, despite the judgment of others, Jack realized that he had never been more sure of anything in his life. This was what he wanted. This was who he wanted to be with. Zira gave him a small, reassuring smile, and Jack couldn't help but smile back. They were in this together. They would face whatever came next, hand in hand. The music began to play softly, signaling the start of the ceremony. Jack took a deep breath and began walking down the aisle toward Zira. Every step felt heavy, but also necessary. As he reached the altar, he saw the Vaxian council watching him, their faces serious and unreadable. The nobles had made their opposition to the marriage clear, and now Jack understood that this moment was about more than just them. It was about the future of Zenthora and its people. Zira stepped forward to join him, and for the first time since arriving on the planet, Jack didn't feel out of place. She was by his side, and that was all that mattered. The high priest of the Vaxian people began the ceremony, his voice deep and resonant, echoing through the hall. He spoke of duty, of union, and of the sacred bond that marriage represented. Jack listened intently, but his mind was focused on the woman standing beside him. This wasn't just a political marriage. This wasn't just a matter of tradition. As the priest turned to Jack, asking him to give his vows, Jack looked into Zira's eyes and spoke from the heart. I don't know what the future holds, and I don't know if we'll ever be fully accepted. But I do know that I want to be with you. I want to face whatever challenges come our way. I choose you, Zira, for now and for always. Zira's eyes filled with emotion, and she nodded. I choose you, Jack, she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions running through her. No matter what happens, I will stand with you. The priest nodded, his expression approving. The vows were made, and in that moment, everything changed. They weren't just bound by law anymore. They were bound by their own choice. The crowd stood as the high priest declared them husband and wife. Jack's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and excitement. He had chosen this. They had chosen this. And together, they would face whatever came next.